welcome to Season 2 of The Case For, a Baseball Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, attorney and baseball fan extraordinaire Russell Christian. On each episode of this podcast, we examine a different Major League Baseball player's career, and I will make the case for whether I believe this player does or does not deserve enshrinement in the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown, New York. If you're someone who spends more time running head-to-head player stat comparisons on Baseball Reference than you do computing your own personal finances, then this is the podcast for you. Friendly reminder, I've never played professional baseball, I'm just a fan. I'm also an attorney, and believe me when I say it's way more fun to debate the pros and cons of a player's hall-worthiness than it is to explain to someone how an 1805 court case involving fox hunting somehow relates to an alleged injunction against the sale of Shohei Ohtani's 50th home run ball. There you go. New season, got to make a new Ohtani reference right there. Speaking of new season, just want to take a brief moment before we get into it to thank everyone who has listened to this podcast, who has interacted with me on Twitter X, where I have an account at The Case For, very active there. When I started this podcast, I'd had this idea for a few years. It took me a while to finally get around to doing it. And anytime you start something new, a podcast, or, business, whatever, I just sort of put it out in the world. And it reminds me of that scene from Batman Begins. If you remember when Batman sneaks into Commissioner Gordon's apartment and starts giving him some tips on how to fight crime. And Commissioner Gordon says something to the effect of, "How am I supposed to do this? I'm just one man." And Batman leans in and says, "Now we're two." That's my bad Batman impersonation. All it takes is one person, and then they tell one person, and they tell one person, and that's how it grows. And that's how this podcast has grown. So I want to thank everyone who has listened. And in order to thank everyone, I'm going to start something new here in Season 2 that I call Superfan Shoutout. Just want to give a quick shout out to some of my super fans out there. First Superfan shout out is someone named Jeff788887, who gave me a very kind review, a written review on Apple Podcasts. If you like the podcast, throw a written review on there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. I also want to give a big shout out to two of my friends and fans on Twitter X. One is someone named TPE Dude in LA who always has great things to say, friendly interactions. Sort of sounds like he's a Dodgers and a Braves fan. So, I'm a Braves fan, but I love Ohtani and love Freddie. So I've been kind of rooting for the Dodgers the past few years. So we have a lot of similar interests. So thanks for your support. You always have insightful comments on my Twitter X page. I also want to give a shout out to someone called the Warmonger. Him and I, or I'm assuming it's him, have struck up kind of a Twitter X friendship. He gives me a lot of shout outs in some of his posts. So just a fun person to talk to. So anyway, if you're out there listening and you're a super fan, I might give you a shout out in a future episode. So also want to sort of recap where we left off in my last episode. On my last episode, I want to apologize. I had indicated I was going to do an episode on Dave Parker and that I wanted to have it out by spring training. Next thing you know, one thing leads to the other. The entire baseball season basically has passed, but that's fine because this is basically an off-season type of podcast. During the season, I like to focus on the season. The Hall of Fame discussion is kind of a fun off-season discussion. But I did mention in my last episode that I was going to be at the Angels-Dodgers spring training game. I did go there, but unfortunately Ohtani didn't play. So if you were there and you heard me, I was the guy on the first base side going, "Where's Ohtani? Where's Ohtani?" That was me being obnoxious on the sideline. We didn't get to see him play. It's okay, though. But I want to mention, while I was there in Phoenix seeing the Cactus League, I went to the Mesa Historical Museum in Mesa, Arizona. A little shout out here. If you haven't seen it, they have a great display on the Cactus League, including the Cactus League Hall of Fame. There's a lot of great memorabilia, great pictures from spring trainings past, way back going into like the 40s, 50s, a lot of black and white pictures of some of the great players and legends of the game. There's some cool memorabilia. They've got the Cactus League Hall of Fame with little plaques. Really cool. So as we're approaching spring training 2025, if you're making plans, if you're planning on going to Cactus League game, definitely stop by that Mesa Historical Museum. Check out that display. It's really cool. One of the players who's in that Cactus League Hall of Fame, Raleigh Fingers, has some memorabilia there in the museum. Actually, I had a chance to meet him during another spring training game I went to, which was the annual Big League weekend spring training game in Las Vegas. This year it was between the A's and the Brewers. That was a pretty cool experience. Actually got a press pass and was able to sit in the dugout, take some pictures. I shared them to my social media, met some of the players, and before the game they had a little bit of a ceremony where they showed some of the schematics for the new A's stadium that they're planning on building here in Vegas, and they had a lot of the A's greats and some of the executives from the A's there. So it was pretty cool. I had a chance to actually meet Raleigh Fingers, and I told him about the Mesa Historical Museum, showed him some of the pictures I took of his memorabilia in the Cactus League Hall of Fame, and he was amused. It was kind of funny. He seemed very interested, but I think there was a part of me that couldn't help but thinking he was saying in his mind, hey, kid, I'm in the actual Hall of Fame, so, Cactus League Hall of Fame, doesn't really interest me, but he didn't say that. He certainly could say that. But anyway, he was very cool. That was a nice experience. Got to see that. Also, too, if you follow me on social media, I was able to catch a Dodgers game in August when I was in L.A., saw Ohtani hit a home run, and man, what a season we've had. Speaking of Ohtani, just get right into it. Even though there's a Dave Parker episode, got to say, just briefly as a fan, looking back on the 2024 regular season, I'm recording this in the middle of the World Series, so I don't know who won yet. Dodgers are up 2-0, but what a great season 2024 was. Briefly, saw some players really stand out. Paul Skeens pitching for the Pirates. Ellie De La Cruz, what a star. I can't wait to see what he does in the future. Bobby Witt really cementing himself as one of the stars of the game. And of course, Judge and Ohtani. Of course, this is a 50-50 season for Ohtani, and these two guys are just at the peak of their powers. It's great to see them what they're doing, and now they're squaring off in the World Series. As of the recording of this podcast, Judge is still slumping a little bit. Ohtani bummed his shoulder out last night. Hopefully he's okay. I'd love to see him come back and have some heroics in his first World Series. I also want to pay my respects to some of the legends of the game who we lost in 2024, starting, of course, with the great Willie Mays, considered by many, I've said it before on this podcast, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, all-around player in baseball history. It's very sad to see him pass just days before the baseball game at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, which was essentially held in his honor. So it's very sad to see the passing of Willie Mays, and we send our prayers to the family of Willie Mays. Also, too, just recently lost the all-time hit king Pete Rose, who I'm going to be mentioning on this podcast. It has several points of his career as they intertwined with Dave Parker. Also, I want to pay my respects to two players who aren't in the Hall of Fame, but who have compelling Hall of Fame cases. Of course, Red Sox legends Louis Tiant, and of course the great Fernando Valenzuela, who've passed away of cancer just before the World Series, and whom the Dodgers really dedicated their postseason, the World Series, to. So my heart goes out to Mays, Rose, Tiant, and Valenzuela, and their families. That's the sort of the recap of the 2024 season, so it's been exciting. I'm looking forward to 2025, but without further ado, y'all aren't here to listen to me recap the season. You're here to listen to me make the case for Dave Parker. This is our first episode of the second season, and it's a good one. Dave Parker was another childhood favorite of mine. I've already done a Lou Whitaker and a Dale Murphy episode, so I got to get to Dave Parker. Now, if you've listened to my previous episodes, as you know, I make the case for a player's induction in three parts. First, I look at statistics, then I look at hardware, and then I look at what I call the fame factor. As for statistics, I look at traditional stats as well as advanced sabermetric statistics. With regard to hardware, I explore awards received, recognitions, honors, achievements. I also like to look at postseason accolades. Finally, I like to explore the fame factor because I think it adds a little bit of fun, some mystery, a little poetry to the whole discussion. Remember, we're talking about a human being who played a game, not numbers on a spreadsheet. As you know, I like to go into the mystic a little bit here and look, because it is the Hall of Fame. I like to see, what the sizzle is on the bacon, so to speak. So, without further ado, we've got a lot to get to. Let's make the case for Dave Parker. Dave Parker grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. A natural athlete, he decided to attend the now defunct Corder Technical High School, which had a great sports program. In his spare time, Parker and his friends loved sneaking into Crosley Field to catch Cincinnati Reds games, and Parker would eventually even get a job selling lemonade at Crosley Field. Parker loved the Reds, and in particular their young star Pete Rose, who Parker said played baseball, quote, like it was a football game, and would be a huge influence on Parker's life and career, both as a young man and then eventually as a player. And this is a good time for me to mention that in preparation for this podcast, I read a lot about Dave Parker, and in particular, I read a book that I want to highly, highly recommend. It's called Cobra, A Life of Baseball and Brotherhood. It's by Dave Parker and Dave Jordan. It's Dave Parker's autobiography. It's out there on the University of Nebraska Press. It is a fantastic book. It is everything I hope for and more. It just has a lot of incredible great stories by Dave Parker about his life in baseball. I'm going to be referencing the book a lot in this podcast, so thank you, Dave Parker, and thank you, Dave Jordan. It's just a fantastic repository of stories about the Pirates and Dave Parker and baseball in the 70s and 80s. If there's one critique I have, I'll get to it later. I wish he had spent a little more time talking about his time on the A's, but we'll get into that later. Anyway, in the book, there's a great story that Parker has about growing up a Reds fan. When he was a young kid, one day him and his friends were at Crosley Field in the parking lot. They're playing baseball, but they didn't have any equipment, so they were using rocks as a ball. So, as kids just wanted to play. They wanted to play baseball so bad, they were playing baseball with rocks. Eventually, they got yelled at by some adults who were worried about their cars, for obvious reasons. Kids were smacking rocks around, and nice cars they were indeed, as the adults that were yelling at them were Cincinnati Reds players Vida Pinson and eventual Hall of Famer Frank Robinson. And as the story goes, I'm sort of paraphrasing it, once Vida and Frank realized what the kids were doing, essentially playing baseball with all they had, scraps and rocks, they thought, all right, we got to help these kids out. And Frank Robinson walked over to his Cadillac, proceeded to open up the trunk and give Parker and his friends just a bunch of balls, bats, gloves, and all this equipment stuff from the Reds. And it told the kids, hey, stop playing with rocks. So anyway, I love this story. It's just it feels like a great passing of the torch from one baseball legend to another. Anyway, Parker didn't waste much time developing his resume as a local sports legend. At Quarter Tech High School, Parker said he wanted to focus on playing ball, and it, quote, didn't matter what the ball was. Guy was just, as a lot of these Hall of Famers that we discuss are, a multi-sport athlete. By his junior year of high school, Parker was 6'4", and weighed 225. He's a big guy, always was a big guy in his career. I can only imagine playing against Parker when he's that big in high school, in junior high school. By his own accounts, he was averaging 20 points a game on the basketball court and at least, according to him, 100 yards and a touchdown per game as a running back on the football team. Parker called football his first love, but unfortunately for Parker, or fortunately for baseball, depending on how you look at it, Parker suffered a pretty nasty knee injury during a high school game against Middletown High School that would eventually require a surgery, but not before Parker played a few more games on the injured knee, and the coaches finally realized how bad it was and forced him to go to the doctor. Now, I tell this story now not to dwell on high school. He had a lot to get into his professional career, but I don't want to focus on his high school too much, other than to say that this sort of sets the tone for Parker's entire career. This is a trait of Parker's tenacity that continued throughout his entire professional baseball career, and that's this desire to play hurt. He says in his book several times, you always play. You play hurt. And indeed, after a month of his knee surgery in high school, Parker he couldn't stand watching his friends play basketball without him. So he found a knee brace and started just playing basketball until finally the coach figured out what was going on and forced him to stop playing and sent him back to the doctor. And Parker kind of recalls this time fondly. He says, Coach Bo probably saved his athletic career with that meeting. I was just a dumb kid. If it hadn't been for him, I would have played with broken bones. That's what Parker says. So Parker's childhood friend Bill Flowers, who he mentions a lot in his books, also talks about this time saying, nothing was ever going to stop Dave Parker from playing sports. Not injuries, not school, not life, nothing. So Parker, he just wanted to play, man. Loved sports. Parker would eventually require a second surgery in his knee in high school. And while he was eventually cleared to play baseball, he was delivered the tough news that not only could football not be a part of his life anymore, but that his knees would probably give him trouble as long as he continued to play sports. So that's kind of a pretty nasty 1-2 whammy. Have two knee surgeries in high school. Nevertheless, he was so talented and athletic that despite these knee injuries and surgeries, he still had a reputation as the best catcher in the city. And that reputation resulted in a tryout, and a lot of people don't know this, for the Baltimore Orioles when he was in high school. It's kind of funny. His scouting report from that workout pegs him as an average hitter with above average hands and arm. But out of 3 potential overall rating qualifications, excellent, good, and fair, Parker's report from that workout listed him as a fair prospect, the lowest of the three. Parker would eventually try out for the Pittsburgh Pirates as well, and their scouting reports were positive enough to warrant drafting Parker in the 4th round of the 1970 Major League Baseball draft. So the Orioles' loss was the Pirates' gain. At this point, I'll say this is really where Parker's baseball origin story takes off. And again, I'll say it again, Parker's autobiography has just so many incredible, funny, and heartfelt stories about his time with the Pirates, both as an up-and-coming minor leaguer and eventual major league star. I just can't get into all of them today, other than to say you've got to read Cobra. It's just an outstanding book. I particularly love the tales of spring training at Pirate City down in Bradenton, Florida, and his tales from the Blue Lantern Bar. Sounds like some swampy dive bar where the players hung out. So there's just a lot of good stories in there. A lot of good Doc Ellis stories. Y'all know I love Doc Ellis, so just read the book. At his first spring training practice, that's kind of funny. Parker was abruptly told he was no longer a catcher and to go play the outfield, where he would stay for the rest of his career. Parker quickly excelled in the Pirates' minor league system. He ended up batting .314 in rookie ball, tying for the league lead in home runs that 1970 season. By 1971's spring training, Parker was full of confidence from his rookie ball season, and the word had gotten around camp about Parker's talents to the point where Pirates legend and Hall of Famer Willie Stargell made a point of introducing himself to Parker. Parker also met another Pirates legend that spring training, Hall of Famer Pie Traynor, who gave Parker some hitting tips. So he was getting looked at by some Hall of Famers early on. This guy he was just loaded with talent, and people knew it. Parker started that 1971 season on the Pirates' Double-A team in Waterbury, Connecticut, where he'd hit only .228 in 30 games before being sent down to the Single-A Pirates in Monroe, North Carolina. Now, change of pace and the reality check did him good. And no matter how talented you are, playing professional sports is tough, and it takes a while to get used to it. But Parker bounced back, and he ended up hitting .358 with 11 home runs in 71 games that season, en route to being named the most outstanding Major League prospect and basking in the organizational glory of the Pirates' 1971 World Championship. For all those reasons, Parker started 1972 spring training with hopes of finally making the Pirates roster, but he would have to settle for the Single-A Salem, Virginia Pirates. Parker was stuck in Single-A again, but he thrived. He hit .310 with 22 home runs and 101 RBI in 135 games. The high point of the season, however, was a brief moment during spring training when Parker was taking batting practice and hitting home run after home run after home run in front of a group of reporters and photographers. And we talked earlier about Frank Robinson giving him gear when he was a kid. This is another sort of passing of the torch moment and story. After this hitting display in 1972 spring training, Parker looked back to see the smiling face of the great Roberto Clemente, who then waved another player to the plate and jokingly said, "Hey, you think I'm going to follow that?" So, he was already getting some accolades from the great Roberto. People knew that Parker was going to be good. And I mention this because Clemente and Parker's careers will kind of forever be intertwined in that Clemente was already the starting right fielder for the Pirates, and Parker was the Pirates' top right fielding prospect. So, Parker's autobiography goes into detail about Parker's recollection of New Year's Day 1973. Parker eulogized his friend, teammate, and mentor, saying that, quote, "Roberto Clemente was more than a humanitarian, more than our spiritual team leader, more than a baseball angel. Roberto was our brother." So that's sort of a sad part of his book, but anyway, Clemente and Parker's careers, like I said, just forever intertwined. And Pirates catcher Manny Sanguillen, the famous story is, Manny went down to try to look for Roberto after the crash, but he tells a story that in 1972, Roberto saw Dave Parker make an outstanding play in the outfield, whereupon he laughed and said, "That's my replacement out there." So between that and the batting practice, Clemente knew his career was getting to the end and that Parker was going to be a very good replacement for him when it was time for him to retire. Unfortunately, Clemente didn't get to retire. He passed away. So that's not to say that Parker didn't have competition for a right field spot amongst other Pirate outfielders. Just as Clemente had cemented right field for the Pirates for almost 2 decades, there was another career Pirate and Hall of Famer, Willie Stargell, who was manning the left field position for most of the prime years of his career in the 60s and 70s. So Needless to say, the Pirates had a lot of outfield talent and only 2 other outfield positions to fill after Clemente passed it, because Stargell was out there and left. They had, and they also had a lot of good players. They had utility outfielder Gene Clines, who, remember, batted .405 in 31 games in 1970, and then .308 in 97 games in 71, and .334 in 1972, and finished 20th in the MVP voting. The Pirates also had Al Scoop, is his nickname, Al Oliver, who has his own Hall of Fame case, a 7-time All-Star, career .303 hitter. There's also Richie Zisk, not exactly a household name anymore, but certainly no slouch. He was a 2-time All-Star, got MVP votes in 3 seasons, finished 9th in the Rookie of the Year voting in 1973. So as good as Parker was, he had a lot of competition for the outfield positions in the Pirates organization. And Parker would start that 1973 season with the Charleston Charlies. I think it's a fun name. It's Pittsburgh's AAA team, where in 84 games he would bat .317 with an .817 OPS and 9 home runs, and was named to the International League's All-Star team. But the minors were still the minors, and Parker recalls a time when the home field was completely flooded by a storm, and mops near his locker to clean up the water. It's the minor leagues for you. It's a reality check. It was at this moment he heard his manager, Joe Morgan, not that Joe Morgan, but another Joe Morgan, call him into his office to announce that Pirates right fielder Gene Clines had suffered a knee injury and that Parker was to catch the next flight to San Diego and join the Pirates in their series against the Padres. Parker recalls the confidence of being the biggest man on both teams. That is until the 8th inning when the Padres played someone who was tall just like him, playing right field just like him, and a rookie just like him. Of course, that was future Hall of Famer Dave Winfield. Parker would have only a 54-game cup of coffee with the Pirates that 1973 season, but he batted a respectable .288. He only had 4 home runs, so the power's not there, but the batting average was good. Parker entered spring training in 1974, again, with high expectations for where his career with the Pirates would take him. And these expectations were punctuated by a moment during spring training, yet another sort of passing the torch moment, when Pete Rose called over to Parker by name and chatted with him and said, "Hey, see you out there, kid." So even Rose knew that Parker was going to be a star. The only problem was that the Pirates were trying Parker out at first base, really just to get him onto the roster more than anything because as I mentioned before, they were loaded with talent in the outfield. And by Parker's own admission, he had no experience playing first base. If he was a good enough athlete, they figured they'd try it. It didn't really work out. He even tells a funny story about a game in Atlanta-Fulton County Stadium. That's where I grew up watching the Braves games. When he took an errant throw to first base in the face, and then went out with Doc Ellis after the game. And some girls were kind of horrified, asked, "Hey, what happened to your face?" And Doc Ellis chimed in and responded, "Hey, it's occupational hazard." So kind of a funny story. Now, I can't mention Dave's 1974 season without briefly addressing a game I discussed in one of my previous episodes, and that is, of course, the May 1974 game where Doc Ellis proceeded to intentionally drill every single Cincinnati Reds player he faced until he was finally pulled by Pirates manager Danny Murtaugh, which honestly may be the wildest part of that story is the fact that he wasn't ejected and that Pirates manager Danny Murtaugh had to actually pull Doc Ellis out of the game. That might be the wildest part of the story. Anyway, Dave Parker tells I won't repeat it, just read the book. He tells his own sort of a ringside version of that story. It's a great story in the book. But in addition to his fielding woes that 1974 season, Parker was also marred by some nagging hamstring injuries that ultimately limited him to only 73 games, but he still got a respectable .282 batting average en route to the Pirates winning the NL East before they lost to the Dodgers in the NLCS. I won't get into it here, other than to say Parker didn't play well in that series, only went 1 for 8. But in his autobiography, he describes that series in detail, and a lot of his reasons, opinions for why he didn't play well. It's just it's a good must-read part of that book for aspiring players and aspiring managers on how to handle budding stars. For the 1975 season, Willie Stargell agreed to move to first base, and that opened up an outfield spot for Dave Parker. And the move ended up working out, as 1975 was Dave Parker's breakout season. His .541 slugging percentage led the National League, and his .308 batting average, 25 home runs, and 101 RBI were good enough for a third-place finish in the MVP race. He also played stellar defense and finished 5th in WAR for position players. Despite being the top write-in candidate for the NL All-Star team, he was ultimately not chosen by Dodgers manager Walter Alston. And that was a slight that Parker never forgot, and for which he made the Dodgers pay dearly after the All-Star break when he hit two home runs in a game against them in Dodger Stadium. As Parker's bat heated up during that 1975 season, he earned an off-field accolade that would stick with him throughout his entire career and indeed become a central part of the lore of Dave Parker. We talk about the fame factor, going into the mystic. This is a key part of Dave Parker's lore. In May of 1975, Cincinnati heavyweight boxing champion Ezzard Charles passed away. Charles was nicknamed the Cincinnati Cobra for his fast punching in the ring, and his passing was a big news story that year. About a week after Ezzard Charles' death, the trainer for the Pirates, who was a big boxing fan, started calling Dave Parker the Cobra as an homage to the fellow Cincinnati sports legend. And soon Pirates play-by-play announcer Bob Prince, who loved giving players nicknames, started referring to Parker as the Cobra on telecasts. And according to Parker, it's kind of funny, even the organist at Three River Stadiums would perform, as he calls it, snake charming music every time he make a big play. So the nickname Cobra stuck that 1975 season. Interestingly enough, Parker wasn't a big fan of the nickname at first, but he said it eventually grew on him, especially as he learned more about Ezzard Charles. Of course, eventually the nickname would become inseparable with Parker, and the Cobra almost became a whole persona, and is indeed the name of his autobiography, so fair to say Parker likes the nickname now. 1975 being his breakout season, it was also the beginning of a 5-year stretch between 1975 and 1979 that could arguably be considered the best of Parker's career. In 1976, he finished 20th in the MVP voting, batting .313 and driving in 90 runs. 1976 also saw another addition to that off-field lore of Dave Parker when he famously donned a t-shirt that said, "If you hear any noise, that's just me and the boys bopping." Of course, these are lyrics from the song Mothership Connection, Star Child by Parliament. You know anything about Parker? No doubt you've seen that famous photo of Parker wearing that t-shirt along with his big hat. It's just part of his lore and part of the swagger that made Parker great. Unfortunately, knee injuries that Parker had been dealing with since high school were just constantly plaguing him. In 1976, they affected his power. As a result, he only had 13 home runs that season. 1976 was also a turning point of sorts for both Parker and the Pirates, who had finished second place, ending the run of 2 straight division titles. It also marked the season where longtime Pirates coach Danny Murtaugh finally retired, only to sadly pass away from a stroke that November, just 2 months after retirement. At the time, Parker was playing off-season baseball in Venezuela and didn't attend the funeral, which he described as one of his deep regrets in life. In his autobiography, he describes that time. His knees were hurting, as they would his entire career. His heart was hurting for the loss of his coach and also still for the loss of Clemente. It was for all those reasons, Parker sought what he called a, quote, feel-good solution to what was ailing him, and by his own admission began using recreational drugs. As he says in his book, all his life he fought the pain, and the pain won. I don't want to get into too much. We'll talk about it a little bit, but that's something that, you have to look at the good and the bad, and he talks about it in his autobiography. He doesn't shy away from it. Anyway, but if 1975 was Parker's breakout year, then 1977 was his statement year, which just really let the whole league know that the Cobra was here to stay and would be a star for a long time to come. Parker would win his first of 2 batting titles that year, leading the National League with a .338 average. He also led the National League in hits and doubles to go along with 107 runs, 21 home runs, 88 RBI, and a .927 OPS. Although he didn't know it at the time, he finished third in the NL in WAR for position players behind Mike Schmidt and George Foster. He also got a hit and scored a run in his first All-Star appearance, and would finish the season with his first Gold Glove and another third-place finish for the National League MVP award. But all of this was a prelude to his 1978 season, which was really his defining season and arguably the best of his career. Parker batted .334 that year, best in all of baseball, for his second consecutive batting title. He also led all of Major League Baseball in OPS and OPS Plus, and led the National League in slugging percentage, total bases, intentional walks, WAR for position players, and offensive WAR. Parker finished second in runs batted in, triples, and on-base percentage, finished third in home runs and runs scored, and fourth in hits with 194. He also stole 20 bases that year. He had speed. So needless to say, Parker dominated 1978 and was rewarded with his first and only Most Valuable Player award that year. To add an exclamation mark on his 1978 season, he also accomplished all of this despite bone chips in his hand that caused him to miss 2 games, as well as yet another intriguing chapter of Dave Parker's lore that occurred that season. During a June 30th game against the Mets at Pittsburgh's Three River Stadium, Parker collided at the plate with Mets catcher John Stearns, which broke Parker's left cheekbone, which had to be surgically repaired. As a result, he missed the All-Star game, which is something we'll discuss later. But when Parker returned from his surgery, he wanted to, first and foremost, he wanted to play. You always play. That's what Parker said. But he wanted to make sure his face was safe. He didn't want to get his cheekbone hurt again. So he worked a solution out with Pirates trainer Tony, the same one that gave him the nickname Cobra. And they found some Pittsburgh Steelers football helmets with face masks that Parker began wearing during batting practice. Although Parker would complain and say they weren't comfortable, they weren't doing enough, he thought, to protect his face. At which point, it's a great story. If you know where I'm going with this. Tony fashioned a half-yellow, half-black, Pirates colors, hockey goalie mask, which Parker began wearing during games to protect his face. So, just like the P-Funk t-shirt, if you're familiar with Parker, no doubt you've seen the photos of Parker playing baseball in the hockey mask, and they were both just absolutely terrifying and just absolutely awesome. The fact that he was playing baseball in a hockey mask looking like Jason Voorhees out there on the field. Just an incredible, kind of a funny part of Dave Parker's lore, but also a compliment. The guy was playing hurt. A lot of players could just say, let me recover and cash my checks. No, he wanted to play, and that's what that was all about. And that was Parker, man. He played hurt, and he had his best season, and he won the MVP award, wearing a dang hockey mask because his face was hurt. So that's Dave Parker right there. Statistically speaking, going into the 1979 season, Parker's 1979 season was a bit anticlimactic after his 2 consecutive batting titles and his monster 1978 season. A down year for Parker, though, was still pretty good. Parker led the National League in extra base hits with 77, and championship wins probability added for offensive player, otherwise known as WPA or CWPA. It's one of those highfalutin advanced statistics. He also finished in the top 5 of the National League in total bases, doubles, runs scored, WAR among position players, offensive WAR, runs created, and was in the top 10 in batting average, on-base percentage, slugging percentage, OPS, hits, RBI, adjusted OPS. His power numbers were .310 batting average, 25 home runs, 94 RBI, 109 runs scored, and a .380 on-base percentage, 526 slugging, and 906 OPS. So, again, a down year for Parker, still pretty good. But beyond those statistics, 1979 was a season in which Parker checked 2 other huge proverbial Hall of Fame boxes. In what is arguably Parker's most famous on-field moment, during the 1979 All-Star Game, Dave Parker threw an absolute just rocket laser cannon throw to Gary Carter at the plate to throw out Brian Downing. If you haven't watched this video, stop what you're doing, go on YouTube, watch it. No exaggeration, it's just one of the best outfield throws to home you'll ever see in baseball history. It's up there with Bo Jackson's famous throw to get Harold Reynolds out of the plate. It's just an incredible play. He just ups and throws this ball all the way in. And credit to Gary Carter. Gary Carter frames it. He took the throw and just got the out. It's just an incredible play, and it just shows the incredible athleticism of Dave Parker. So that throw, along with Parker's 1 hit and a sac fly for an RBI, led to Parker being named the 1979 All-Star Game MVP for the winning National League squad. Now, the winning didn't stop there, however. In the 1979 Pirates, they cruised to 98 victories to finish first in the NL East and promptly swept the Big Red Machine, the National League West winning Cincinnati Reds, in 3 straight games en route to their second World Series appearance of the decade. Parker ended up having 4 hits, 2 runs, and 2 RBI in those 3 games, the NLCS. In the 1979 World Series against the Baltimore Orioles, Parker batted .345 with 10 hits, including 3 doubles, 2 walks, 2 runs scored, and 4 RBI. In a season where Parker had already been named All-Star Game MVP, Parker was now a World Series champion. He'd finished the season a Gold Glove winner and 10th place in the MVP vote, with, of course, his teammate and Pirates legend Willie Stargell winning the MVP that season, along with Keith Hernandez, the only time in MLB history which has been co-MVPs. Kind of an interesting factoid. 1980 was a bit of a down year for Parker offensively. Batted .295 with 17 home runs and 79 RBI, but his numbers were still good enough to go along with his popularity to get him named to the All-Star team. But he's actually the top vote getter amongst NL outfielders, so he's a very popular player. The strike-shortened season of 1981, however, really marked the beginning of a temporary decline for Parker that lasts the next 4 seasons. Parker admits in his autobiography it was a bad season, his knees were killing him, he batted only .258, but his popularity got him elected to another All-Star team. Now, I won't get into details here because Parker talks about it better and in length, better than I can, but, in the wake of his success of the 70s, the 80s started with Parkway, as his friends called him, the new contract, making good money with the Pirates, and kind of in a bit of a party mood, as well as looking to nurse some of his long ailing knees. His long ailing knees. By his own admission, that lifestyle took a bit of a toll, and he kind of talks about it, and there's someone he calls the medicine man, gave him some medicine to help his knee pain. It really didn't help with any of the other aspects of his body and mind. I don't want to get into it, but some of those off-the-field things took their toll. But anyway, 1982 also took a toll on Parker as well, because it was Willie Stargell's last season. By Parker's own admission, Stargell had been a mentor, a bit of a father figure to Parker in the decade that he was on the Pirates. And he describes Willie's retirement as, quote, like the death of his youth. So it kind of left Parker lost and wandering. And there's just a great moment in his autobiography when Willie kind of consoles Parker saying, hey, get healthy and go find the Cobra. I know he's still in there somewhere. So kind of an emotional part there. Dave was a little lost, and we can relate. We all have times in our life here, not to get too philosophical, where we get a little lost, maybe we get sidetracked. So get a little teary-eyed, reading that quote and thinking about, we've all had those moments in our life. But I think it just goes to underscore how the story of Dave Parker is truly just a great story of high highs, low lows, comebacks, and just has all the ingredients of a great Hollywood story. And this is the Hollywood movie where Dave is sort of down in the dumps mentally, physically, and Willie sees something special in Parker. He knows there's something special there, and he says, hey, go find the Cobra. So anyway, a key part of this redemption and comeback story occurs after the 1983 season, when free agent Dave Parker would end up signing with his hometown Cincinnati Reds. Now, this is a great reunion for him. He eventually got to play a few seasons with his childhood hero, Pete Rose. Also, too, got a chance to play the role that Willie Stargell had played for him for an entirely new generation of young Red stars, including Eric Davis. If you remember, I grew up in the 80s. Eric Davis was one of the biggest stars in baseball in the 80s, and definitely would be a Hall of Famer if he hadn't gotten a lot of injuries that kind of cut his career short. But the change of scenery was good for Parker, both on and off the field. And in 1984, his first season with the Reds, he played in 156 games, so almost every game of the year, hit a very respectable .285 with 16 home runs and 94 RBI. So whatever was happening in Cincinnati seemed to be working, as Parker did find the Cobra again. In 1985, he had an absolutely banner year that could arguably be considered the best of his career. Up there with his MVP season. He played in 160 games. He led the National League in doubles, RBI, total bases, and intentional walks, and bashed 34 home runs to go with a .312 batting average. He was named to another All-Star team and finished second in the MVP voting behind Willie McGee and won his first Silver Slugger Award. Now, it's worth noting, we'll get into this a little bit, the Silver Slugger Award began in 1980, so we'll get into that when we talk about hardware, but fair to say Parker would have won a few in the 70s, but he won his first there. He also continued, more importantly, his career renaissance in 1986, playing in all 162 games that year. That's first time, I think the only last time in his career he did that. So he was dedicated. He was looking to bounce back and find the Cobra again, and he certainly did. He had 31 home runs with 116 RBI, and again led the National League in total bases. He finished fifth in the MVP voting, was named an All-Star, and won his second straight Silver Slugger. Now, Parker was now kind of facing the twilight of his career, but he showed the world the Cobra wasn't done, and he had three final encores to what was already up to that point a very good career, and one that certainly had him in Hall of Fame consideration. The second encore, as we discussed, was sort of a career renaissance with the Reds. But in 1988, Parker signed with the Oakland Athletics. Now, if you don't remember, the Oakland Athletics, it's sad they're not in Oakland anymore. Going to be in Sacramento, and then eventually maybe in Las Vegas. They haven't been very good for a few years. Kind of a downtime. My heart goes out to Oakland Athletics fans. But for those of you who don't remember, The Oakland Athletics, not only were they a powerhouse in the 70s, but they were an absolute powerhouse in the late 80s and early 90s. And Parker's veteran presence helped the A's with their young sluggers, Mark McGwire and Jose Canseco, of course, the Bash brothers, how can you forget them? And although 1988 was a bit of a down year for Parker, he only played 101 games, hit 12 home runs. Parker did have 3 hits in the ALCS that year en route to the World Series. Unfortunately, the A's famously lost to the Dodgers in 4 games. This was the famous Kirk Gibson home run series. I'm sorry, 5 games. In 1989, however, Parker showed that the Cobra still had some venom in his fangs, and he hit 22 home runs, drove in 97, and batted .264. It's very respectable. More importantly, however, he had 2 home runs in the 1989 ALCS against the Toronto Blue Jays, and hit a home run in the 1989 World Series, the Bay Series, where the A's beat the San Francisco Giants. That was the famous series where the earthquake happened. I remember that. It was a sad series in some ways, but a great series in terms of baseball. The slugging veteran finished 11th in the MVP votes that season, and as a free agent, he signed with the Milwaukee Brewers, where in 1990, Parker would have really his last good season. 1990 was a very good year for Parker. He batted .289, 21 home runs, and 92 RBI, and was named to his 7th and final All-Star team. He won another Silver Slugger and finished 16th in the MVP voting. I'll say here that Parker, in his autobiography, he says relatively little. I mentioned this before, and circling back to it. He says relatively little about his time in the A's, other than to say, and I quote, "I could write a whole other book on those 2 years playing with the Oakland A's." Well, Dave Parker and Dave Jordan, if you are listening to this podcast, I would very much like to hear stories of the Oakland A's. That's a great team. I loved cheering for those teams when I was a kid. So if you're listening to this and you got some time, we'd love to hear another book about Dave Parker's time with the Oakland A's. But unfortunately, for Parker, his time with the Brewers would be really the last hurrah for Parker. And as he started the 1991 season with the California Angels, he would be teammates with Dave Winfield, the other big guy that he had met at the beginning of his career. Parker batted only .232 in 119 games for the Angels before getting released in September. But again, looking at the Hollywood ending and one final, if brief, encore performance, Parker got a call from his friend Cito Gaston asking if Parkway wanted to come play for the Blue Jays. In 13 games with the Blue Jays, Parker emptied the tank. He batted .333 and hit a double in the game where the Blue Jays clinched the division. So went out with a bang, and it was good to see that. Interestingly, Parker says he got an offer before the 1992 season to play for the rebuilding Philadelphia Phillies, but he turned it down. And you can't speculate, but I like to play the what if game. It's interesting. What if Parker had decided he wanted to go back and play with the Phillies, who, as you know, made the World Series in 1993. It would have been interesting to see if he could have contributed in any way to the Phillies' success. But nevertheless, you always want to go out with a bang. And like I said, he emptied the tank, hit over .333 in 13 games, hit a double, clinched the division. He figured that was his time to walk away, and I can't blame him. You want to walk away on top. So without further ado, that's sort of the biography section of Dave Parker. Let's get into the statistics of Dave Parker's career. With regard to Dave Parker's statistics, as you know, I like to discuss both traditional or counting statistics as well as some of the advanced sabermetric statistics. With Parker, it's kind of a good news, bad news situation, and I'm going to start with the bad news first. Now, with regard to some of the advanced statistics, sabermetrics, they really don't help Parker's case. Let me discuss here. Let's look at WAR. I'll probably do an entire episode breaking down WAR. It's somewhat complicated, but also helpful. For now, just know that WAR is so complicated, there's actually 2 types of WAR. B-WAR and F-WAR. B-WAR is calculated by my favorite website, Baseball Reference, and F-WAR refers to Fangraphs calculations. So right out of the gate, there's actually 2 different types of WAR, so it just shows you right there, a little complicated. Parker's B-WAR is 40.1, and his F-WAR is 41.1. So if this is all confusing, just have no fear. Again, I think I'm going to do an episode breaking down and demystifying WAR. Just know that for today's purposes, I will be discussing his B-WAR, or his wins above replacement, as calculated by Baseball Reference, because for those of you keeping track, the B-WAR, or Baseball Reference, is the WAR number I've been using in all my other podcasts. So I don't want to change horses in midstream and go to F-WAR. We're going to stick with B-WAR here. As I've said before, with regard to WAR, and for those of you who haven't listened to this podcast and are unfamiliar with WAR, it's wins above replacement. It's an interesting number in theory, as I've said. It's essentially trying to determine how many wins this player brings. So in a particular season, your WAR for the season, let's say your WAR is 7. In theory, what that means is you brought 7 wins to the team, as opposed to a replacement player. That's why wins above replacement. So it's sort of it's a helpful statistic. It can be seen as sort of a magic bullet, or that's sort of one of the weaknesses of WAR. But it is a helpful statistic. And what I'll just say briefly, I'm not opposed to sabermetrics, but if you've seen the movie Moneyball and you're aware of the sabermetrics revolution, the whole idea was to try to find ways beyond the traditional statistics to find value in players, because small market teams like the Oakland A's couldn't afford the players with the big batting averages, the home runs, all these sort of things, the gaudy counting numbers. They wanted the big contracts and said, well, how can we get players that can still be good, but not, want the kind of money that these players want. Well, the way they did that was they looked at other statistics, focusing particularly like on base percentage or other different ways to say, hey, we can find value in this player that isn't necessarily, reflected in the big power numbers, but we can find value. And if we put 9 of these players collectively on a team together, we can win. So anyway, that's Moneyball in sort of a nutshell. I digress. I've said it before with regard to WAR. Between 70 and 75 career WAR is sort of that sweet spot. If a player has a WAR, 75 or higher, they're really in Hall of Fame territory. As I've said before, if you look at the list of players with the career 75 or WAR, almost all of them in the Hall of Fame with a few exceptions. There's sort of the PED guys or some ineligibility issues, so like the A-Rods, Bonds, and Roses and stuff. And there's 1 or 2 players, too, that have played so long ago, nobody knows who they are. One of them is Bill Dolan. I've mentioned him before in a previous podcast. I'll do an episode about him, but fair to say, everyone that's like 75 or higher in career WAR is either Hall of Fame or Hall of Fame caliber, or should be in the Hall of Fame, but have kept off-field issues that kept them out. So if 70 to 75 is kind of the sweet spot, where's Parker land in all this? Well, Parker's WAR is 40.1, as we mentioned, is his B WAR. So if WAR is a big factor in your Hall of Fame candidacy case, this might be an open shut case for you. Say, Parker's WAR isn't good enough, right? Well, not necessarily. I'm here to say that, WAR isn't the end-all, be-all. This is kind of a big philosophical issue I have. I think sometimes people put too much stock in it. Because here's my thought. While I do think WAR has been a useful metric to look beyond the traditional stats and evaluate players' value, again, for small market teams trying to compete, the guys, the teams that can't hire and sign the Ohtanis and Judges of the world, how do we find value? I mentioned Bobby Witt earlier at the beginning of this season. Now, he has some good statistics, but, he has a good WAR, and he's good in terms of the advanced statistics. And, there's a lot of people saying he should get the MVP because he's more valuable, et cetera, et cetera. That's an interesting discussion. So the big issue I do have with WAR, WAR is certainly not without its shortcomings. And again, I think people look at it like it's the one ring, from Lord of the Rings, like the one stat to rule them all. And I don't think that's fair when you're evaluating players that played really before the advanced statistics revolution, because you're essentially judging players based upon a statistic they didn't even know existed when they played. And now, you could be saying to yourself right now, yeah, but we know now, with the advanced statistics, the WAR computates and finds, the right players. And if you look like, leaders in WAR all time, it's like Babe Ruth, Walter Johnson. So in some ways it reinforces, some of these all-time greats are all-time greats. But here's my point. I keep talking about Parker's autobiography. In the autobiography, he mentions, just like I've seen in interviews with a lot of other players, they've mentioned this too. They mentioned the batting average was kind of the standard by which they were judged. So if you look at, if you're a player playing before the advanced sabermetric revolution, batting average and home runs and RBI, so the power numbers, those are the standards by which you get drafted. Those are the standards by which you stay on the team, get re-signed, or get signed as a free agent. Those are the numbers by which you get paid. So those are the numbers that they are looking at. So Parker talks about in his autobiography, like batting average is the benchmark along with home runs and RBI. And that's what he focused on. He was always focusing on batting average. Batting average has kind of been put offside in terms of on-base percentage. And you look at players now, Look at Juan Soto, for instance. Juan Soto is one of the best hitters. He really focuses on base percentage to the point where he does a little shuffle when he gets a walk and everything like that, which I think is a little. I'm like, you walked, A lot of players from Parker's era would say, and Parker even talks about in his book, like they would say, I didn't want to walk. I wanted to get a hit. A walk was like, oh gosh, I didn't get a chance to hit. So different mindset. All I'm going to say, look, I could talk about this, at length. But when the benchmark is batting average or home runs, RBI, that's what the players are shooting for. That's what they focus on. And if the players, like today's players, knew that WAR or on-base percentage or walks, some advanced numbers beyond the power stats, if they know that's how it's calculated, then they change their game to increase those numbers. And there's a lot of players that do that. They're focusing now, like, hey, what's my WAR? What's my offensive WAR? That if that's the number by which you're tracked, that's the number by which you're signed, by re-signed, by getting money. And like that's what you're going to focus on. So, that's my soapbox here a little bit. Is that it's kind of unfair to say, oh yeah, this advanced statistic that they didn't even know existed, therefore nullifies his case to the Hall of Fame. I don't necessarily think that's fair. But anyway, I digress. Soapbox over. If we look at, as I said, 70 to 75 is sort of the sweet spot. There are still, again, nevertheless, a lot of Hall of Famers, great players, legends of the games, who do have considerably lower career WARs than 70 to 75. Interestingly, Parker's career 40.1 WAR ties him with Albert Bell and Dave Concepcion and Ryan Zimmerman. Now, I don't think Zimmerman has a Hall of Fame case, but actually Albert Bell and Dave Concepcion have pretty good Hall of Fame cases. Now, you might disagree with me, but it's fair to say these aren't nobodies. These are good players that he's up there with. I also want to say Parker's career WAR actually stacks up favorably with some of his contemporaries, the 80s and 90s, and it's actually higher than Harold Baines, Hall of Famer, 38.8, higher than Juan Gonzalez, 38.7 career WAR. People may forget Juan Gonzalez now, but at one time he was a household name. He was always on the highlights and ESPN every night. He was a feared slugger. The guy was a two-time MVP, finished his career with 434 home runs and a 295 average. And had it not been for what I think are some obvious, PED suspicions, I think otherwise he has a very good Hall of Fame case. Certainly a Hall of Fame caliber player, whether it was assisted a little bit with some pharmaceutical, I don't know. It's for history to decide. But, again, these aren't nobodies. Parker has a higher career WAR than Kirk Gibson. Kirk Gibson, 38.4. He has a higher career WAR than Chili Davis, than four-time batting champion and teammate Bill Madlock, a higher career WAR than Steve Garvey, a higher career WAR than Eric Davis, who I mentioned before, a higher career WAR than Ken Caminetti. Again, these aren't, with the exception of Baines, these guys are in the Hall of Fame, but these certainly aren't nobodies. These are good players. Parker's career WAR is also higher than Hall of Famers, as we mentioned, Harold Baines, higher than Pie Traynor, the fellow Pirates legend who Parker actually met, discusses in his autobiography, higher than Hack Wilson, Ernie Lombardi, George Kell, and Bill Mazeroski. So there are guys in the Hall of Fame with lower career WARs than Dave Parker. So, it doesn't necessarily mean that he can't get in. So the career WAR of 40.1, doesn't really help his case, but I don't think it hurts as much as some might think because of, again, some of the people I just mentioned. Likewise, his career offensive WAR of 41.7 ties him with Ken Griffey Sr. for the 302nd all-time. So again, doesn't necessarily hurt his case. And Ken Griffey Sr., not in the Hall of Fame, but certainly not a bad player, and certainly a player that has a compelling Hall of Fame case. At least he's worth the conversation. But his career offensive WAR, Dave Parker's, is higher than Hall of Famers Harold Baines, Frank Chance, and Gil Hodges. So there are guys in the Hall of Fame, and I keep mentioning Baines. Baines, I don't want to get off of Harold Baines. It was kind of a controversial pick at the time. Even at the time myself, I was thinking, geez, Harold Baines, I don't know. In retrospect, now that I've looked at his career and the stats, I think Harold Baines definitely is a Hall of Famer. He was someone, people might call him a compiler, but I think that's a bad term. I mean, the guy played consistently for a long time, racked up a lot of numbers. He was just consistently a very good player. So, no disrespect to Harold Baines. And I'm mentioning this WAR because Baines played, his career overlapped with Parker's in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Parker has a higher career WAR and a career offensive WAR. So I think that bodes well for Parker. But interestingly, too, I'll say Parker's career offensive WAR is higher than Hall of Fame candidates Andrew Jones, who I've done a podcast for, and I made the case. Spoiler alert, I think Andrew Jones belongs in the Hall of Fame. Dave Parker also has a higher career offensive WAR than 80s fan favorite Don Mattingly and current postseason hero Giancarlo Stanton, whose Hall of Fame candidacy has been a big topic of discussion during this 2024 postseason. Did have that home run in Game 1 of the World Series. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough for the Yankees to win that game. So anyway, to wrap up discussion of Parker's WAR, I'll just reiterate that if Parker knew that WAR was a thing, if he knew how it was computed, I think he would have tried to make sure his WAR was higher. I mean, he definitely talks about knowing what his batting average was at all times and trying to make sure that was high. That's how he stayed on the team. It's how he got paid. It's how he got voted in the All-Star game, stuff like that. So he knew how his counting stats were getting tracked. And if he knew that WAR was going to be something that helped him, get signed, get paid, helps his Hall of Fame case, I think he would have, been asking some of the stat heads, hey, how do I get a higher WAR? What do I have to do? And, so that's all I'm going to say. Anyway, enough about WAR. Let's look at Dave Parker's counting statistics, because I think this is really one of his strongest arguments here for induction in the Hall of Fame. He has really good counting statistics. In 19 Major League seasons, Dave Parker tallied a whopping 2,712 hits to go along with 1,272 runs, 526 doubles, 75 triples, 339 home runs, 1,493 RBI, 154 stolen bases, a career .290 batting average, a .339 on base percentage, a .471 slugging percentage, an .810 OPS, and 4,405 total bases. Now, in terms of his counting stats, I want to talk initially about this total bases and the hits. Those really stand out. Let's break those down a bit. Parker had 4,405 total bases. That's a lot. He had 6 seasons with 300 or more total bases and led the National League 3 times in that category. Parker's ranked 56th all-time in career total bases. Of the 55 players with more career total bases, all of them are in the Hall of Fame except for 9 players. Pujols, Bonds, A-Rod, Pete Rose, Rafael Palmeiro, Miguel Cabrera, Manny Ramirez, Gary Sheffield, and Carlos Beltran. Now, of those 9, Pujols and Cabrera are not eligible yet, certainly will be in the Hall of Fame. In fact, let's just call it right now. It's a good chance Pujols gets elected unanimously, and Miguel Cabrera as well. Of that remaining 7, those are, of course, Hall of Fame caliber players who basically are not in the Hall of Fame for other reasons. Rose for gambling, others for PED issues. So, long story short, of that list, there's only really one player with more career total bases, no off-field issues, keeping them out of the Hall of Fame, and that's Carlos Beltran, who, of course, we discussed in Season 1, Episode 10, and who certainly has a very strong Hall of Fame case, and I think he's going to get in one day. But what about the players just behind Parker on the career total base list? There's also a lot of Hall of Famers on that list, but Parker has more career total bases than, get this, Mike Schmidt, Eddie Matthews, Todd Helton, Tony Gwynn, Jeff Bagwell, Harmon Killebrew, Jim Rice, and his Hall of Fame teammate Willie Stargell. So his career total bases really helps his Hall of Fame case. Now let's look at Parker's career hit total of 2,712. Didn't get that magic number of 3,000. I've said it before. 3,000 hits, and with no off-field issues, is pretty much one of the few stats that's just an automatic induction. You get 3,000 hits, no off-field issues, you're in the Hall of Fame, period. And I'll stand by that. Parker didn't quite get to 3,000, but he still has more career hits than a lot of Hall of Famers, including Billy Williams, Nellie Fox, Tim Raines, a contemporary, played in the 80s, Vlad Guerrero, Ted Williams. Now, Ted missed some years due to the wars, but still, it's when you say you have more hits than Ted Williams, it's pretty impressive. More hits than Reggie Jackson, more hits than Todd Helton, who just got in the Hall of Fame, more hits than Joe Morgan, and more hits than Fred McGriff, who just recently got in the Hall of Fame. Also more than David Ortiz, Frank Thomas, and Jim Rice. Jim Rice was contemporary Dave Parker's. Now, this is where I want to sort of zero in on some counting stats here that I think really make the case for Dave Parker more than just reciting a list of his stats. Dave Parker, if you've been snoozing so far, this is the time to pay attention. Get ready, buckle up. We're going to get crazy right here. Dave Parker is one of only 19 players in Major League history with 2,700 or more hits, 300 or more home runs, and a career .290 or more batting average. I want to read you the list of names. So these are players, again, with 2,700 or more hits, 300 or more home runs, and a career .290 or higher batting average. Now, for dramatic effect, I'm going to read you the list of names. Hank Aaron, Stan Musial, Albert Pujols, Willie Mays, Miguel Cabrera, George Brett, Alex Rodriguez, Al Kaline, Frank Robinson, Barry Bonds, Rogers Hornsby, Al Simmons, Mel Ott, Babe Ruth, Ivan Rodriguez, Chipper Jones, Lou Gehrig, Dave Parker, and Billy Williams. You might be thinking to yourself, that is about as exclusive company as it comes. Now, you also might be thinking to yourself, Russ, I've listened to your podcast before, and I know you've said, and I have said, oftentimes when you start doing these one of only X players with this combination of stats, it's very easy to start, kind of tweaking them and stuff, and sometimes you find some outliers, but these aren't exactly weird statistics. It's not a weird combination of most intentional walks and most caught stealing and highest fielding percentage. I mean, these are pretty big statistics here. Hits, home runs. I mean, these are some pretty major statistics, batting averages. So if you're following me on this journey, we're going to go a little deeper here. If you narrow that list of 19 players, who I just read those off, those are 19 of the greatest players to ever play the game. If you were to narrow that list to those with 150 or more career stolen bases, Parker is one of only 8 players in Major League Baseball with 2,700 or more hits, 300 or more home runs, a career batting average of 290 or higher, and 150 or more stolen bases. The other 7, Barry Bonds, Hank Aaron, Alex Rodriguez, Willie Mays, Frank Robinson, Chipper Jones, George Brett. Pretty elite company if you ask me. Now, if you think that's crazy, let's just crank it up one more notch because, hey, why not? Of those 8 players, the only players in Major League history with 2,700 or more hits, 300 or more home runs, 150 or more stolen bases, 75 or more triples, and a career batting average of 290 or higher. Barry Bonds, Hank Aaron, Willie Mays, Dave Parker, George Brett. That is pretty exclusive company. And again, these aren't weird statistics. These are pretty basic counting statistics. So if you ask me, Dave Parker sits, in terms of his counting stats, in some extremely limited, rare, and elite company. So while he doesn't have some of the milestones like 3,000 hits, 500 home runs, he has very, very respectable career numbers and counting numbers. And I hope you can see, like I have, that when you total up his career counting stats in some of these big categories, he stacks up there on these short lists with some of the all-time greats. Now let's look at hardware. As you know, I like to look at awards. I also like to look at postseason accolades and statistics here. Dave Parker was a 7-time All-Star, 3-time Gold Glove winner, 3-time Silver Slugger winner, 2-time batting champion, and the 1979 All-Star Game MVP. He also won World Series in 1979 with the Pirates, and then 10 years later with the Oakland A's in 1989. Now, it's a slippery slope to start getting into the what-ifs or he should have. As you know, I like to play the game of sometimes, this player didn't win the MVP but should have. I get that's an admittedly slippery slope, but I want to say, only because really, it's weird. With some voters, I read some of the journalists and the justifications. All-star appearances are like a huge thing with some voters. They say, oh, he only was picked to, a few all-star teams. Or I see them say, oh, he was picked to 11 or 12 all-star teams. He must be a star. So I think you should look at the full picture. But because there are people out there that all-star appearances is a huge factor in their Hall of Fame considerations, I do want to mention that 7 all-star appearances is certainly very good, very respectable. But there's players out there with 7 or more all-star appearances who probably don't have good Hall of Fame chances. I just want to say, as I mentioned before, he would have easily had 8 all-star appearances because in 1978, his MVP season, right before the all-star game, he smashed his face up. So, again, I don't want to play the what-if game. He wasn't an all-star, but he wasn't an all-star this season because he got hurt. And again, it's part of his story. He played hurt. He put on a hockey mask and played hurt. So, fair to say, very easily should have had 8 all-star appearances. I think it's fair to say he would have gone to the all-star game. He won the MVP that season and a batting title. Fair to say he would have made the all-star team. So really he should have 8 all-star appearances. And really he should have 9. Parker talks about in his autobiography he was the highest write-in candidate. But then the Dodgers coach didn't let him on the team. There was some politics. And he made him hit a home run against the Dodgers. So again, he only has officially 7, but really he should have 9. Also, too, again, kind of a slippery slope to give extra awards, etc. But with regard to the 3 Silver Sluggers, as I said, 1980 was the first year they introduced the Silver Slugger. He won 2 batting titles and MVP in the 70s. So, if he had won, let's just assume he would have won Silver Sluggers the year he won the batting titles. That's 5 Silver Sluggers. So, could have almost had 9 All-Star appearances, 5 Silver Sluggers. Some people don't care about this stuff. It's all stats or all advanced stats. But to some people, this stuff matters. So, if you're looking at this saying, hey, 7 All-Stars, 3 Silver Sluggers, it's not that much. I'm like, really, it's 9 and probably 5 Silver Sluggers, if not more. But again, that's a slippery slope, so it is what it is. I do want to focus on the fact that, he's a World Series champion in 1979 and 1989, and not just a World Series champion, but in a meaningful way. It's kind of funny sometimes when people are making the Hall of Fame cases for certain players. They'll say, World Series champion, and then you look and you're like, they didn't really play. Maybe it was like the end of their career and they were, kind of a pinch hitter, maybe got 1 or 2 at-bats in the World Series. Or I'm not trying to pick on them, but right now we're the Dodgers-Yankees World Series. Clayton Kershaw is hurt. He's not playing. Clayton Kershaw is a Hall of Famer. I'm not saying he's not a Hall of Famer, but when you're making the Hall of Fame case for him, if the Dodgers are able to pull this off and win, technically you can add that to Clayton Kershaw's resume as a World Series champion in 2024 if the Dodgers win. But it's like, he didn't play. So I'm not trying to take anything away. He pitched during the season, and even if you play one game or throw one pitch, or you have contributed to the team. I'm not taking anything away from Clayton Kershaw, but there is a difference sometimes when you're evaluating for the Hall of Fame case, whether they happened to be on a World Series team or whether they were a meaningful part of the World Series conversation. And Dave Parker, we talked about his stats before. He had a meaningful contribution to 2 World Series champion teams. And again, it's a slippery slope. I can't really, count it, but I did mention in the mid 80s, towards the late 80s, before he went with Oakland, he was on the Cincinnati Reds, who were rebuilding and had a really good core nucleus of young players. I mentioned Eric Davis, also Cal Daniels. They had some really good players. And Parker was a mentor to these young players who looked up to him, and he taught them the ways of baseball. The Cincinnati Reds, with that core nucleus of players like Eric Davis, ended up winning the 1990 World Series. So you can't really count that as 3. It's kind of like 2 and an asterisk. Fair to say, Parker, even though he wasn't still on the team, he mentored a group of players that played together well and eventually won a World Series with the Reds. So that's just something, it's part of Parker's legacy. And that's probably a good time to get, you can't really count that as an official piece of hardware, but that's just a great time to segue into finally the fame factor. Parker, I will say, if you look at him, this is one of those nebulous sports terms. He was a winner. He wanted to win. He said, he wanted to play hurt. He did play hurt, and he wanted to win. And that winning mentality, he talks about the sip, champagne, getting the champagne in the locker room when you win, when you clinch a division or a pennant or World Series. He said it's all about that sip, getting that celebration, having that party when you win. He wanted to win, and he instilled his winning ways everywhere he went. Won 2 World Series, and again, he wasn't just in '89. He wasn't just some old guy sitting there with a couple occasional pinch hits that was just along for the ride. No, he was, at the end of his career and belting 2 home runs and helped 2 different teams win. He helped mentor a generation of Reds that eventually won a World Series in 1990. So he was a winner. And he was definitely a player. Look, I will say Dave Parker is definitely one of the players that benefits from the fame factor. Some of the guys we discussed, hey, they have great numbers, but, you look back on them and it's like, oh, yeah, that guy, oh, yeah, he was pretty good. Dave Parker was a star. If you're looking at sort of the fame factor, the sizzle and the bacon, he was one of the biggest stars of the 70s, a perennial all-star game MVP, 2-time World Series champ, had a great nickname, the Cobra. His friends called him Parkway. And you get this sense from reading his book. He just has a lot of fun off-the-field stories. The P-Funk t-shirt, his outgoing personality, the hockey mask, and he was known for swinging a sledgehammer in the on-deck circle, something he picked up from Willie Stargell. So all these, you get the impression reading his book that he was a fun guy. The other people liked him, and they hung out with him, and he was, he was a popular guy in the league. He was popular amongst the fans. Unfortunately, I mentioned it before, and I don't want to knock him, but I can't not mention this. His fame did turn into a bit of notoriety during the 80s due to his involvement in the Pittsburgh drug trials. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it. We could do an entire episode. There's books out there. There's some great books out there. He discusses a lot of this in his autobiography. As I mentioned before, he admits to cocaine use, he got in some trouble, and he paid the price in those Pittsburgh drug trials. And I really think that's why he wasn't initially voted into the Hall of Fame. I think there was some lingering resentment for, oh, this is the guy that was caught up in some of the stuff. It was, sort of a bad look for baseball. But, time is a great healer. In the movie Lincoln, if you remember Daniel Day-Lewis, he says, probably misquoted, he says, time is a great thickener of things. And we've seen other players involved in that scandal welcome back into the fold of Major League Baseball, including Keith Hernandez, who's very involved with Major League Baseball as an announcer. And he has his own very good Hall of Fame case. Tim Raines, he testified during those drug trials. He's in the Hall of Fame. And I really think Tim Raines is sort of a good test case. It's like, you know what? I honestly think for years Tim Raines did not get into the Hall of Fame for that reason, but now he's in. And I say this, look, I love Tim Raines. I still have a bunch of his baseball cards. I'm not trying to dig up old bones, but I'm just saying, like, he was involved in that, and now he's in the Hall of Fame. So if people are still going to hold that against Parker, I think that's a bit unfair. He certainly was not the only player caught up in, some bad life decisions. I'm not trying to make excuses. It was the 70s. It was the 80s. A lot of players are doing it. He talks about in his autobiography, too. Like, he did have knee problems. He had knee pains, and, nothing was working. He's trying to medicate it, and that seemed to have helped. And, he admits he got a little far gone. And I think it really hurt his Hall of Fame chances, too, on the field, because there were some seasons where he probably could have done better. And that's why there's Willie Stargell's story saying, I hope you find the Cobra again. So, if he had... maybe if he didn't have the bad knees, and in a lot of ways, it's kind of similar to Mickey Mantle. Now, Mickey Mantle, obviously, Hall of Famer, Hall of Fame stats, but one of the big what ifs of Mickey Mantle's career is, what if he didn't have the bad knees, and what if he didn't have all the off field, like the party in the off season and off the field. So, in some ways, I see Parker and Mickey as very similar in that they were just insanely talented. Both had bad knees and both had some very human, weaknesses off the field, which I'm not here to judge. But with that, I will say, again, just soapbox here, he's human. He made some mistakes. He owned up to those mistakes. And we've seen players who made similar mistakes now, get back into the fold of Major League Baseball and get into the Hall of Fame. So with that, I want to finish this episode, this very long episode. Thank you for sticking with me. Most of my episodes aren't this long, but I love Dave Parker. I wanted to make sure I, thoroughly researched his Hall of Fame case. And I want to finish this podcast episode with a plea. The Classic Baseball Era Committee will be meeting at the 2024 winter meetings and voting on 8 different individuals. This era focuses on players and executives prior to 1980. So I'm not sure 100% definitively if this includes Parker. I have read some things online that Parker may be one of the players that is considered. If so, I would love to see him get on that ballot, and I would love to see him get elected. And if not this year, then as soon as possible in one of the upcoming Era Committee votes. I really think that the Era Committee votes have been helpful. Since I first had the idea for starting this podcast, it took me, like I said in the beginning, a while to sort of get, off my rear and finally get around to doing it. But a couple of the players that I really wanted to focus on this podcast and make episodes about have gotten in. Fred McGriff and Minnie Minoso, 2 players that I was happy to see got in the Hall of Fame before I had a chance to do an episode about them. So I think the Era Committee has really done a good job of correcting some past wrongs in terms of the Hall of Fame voting. And not to put too fine a point on it, as a fan, you probably all know that Dave Parker has recently valiantly been fighting Parkinson's disease. My grandfather died of Parkinson's disease when I was just a baby, never had a chance to get to know him. So speaking from the heart here, as a fan, I would just absolutely love to see Parker not just get in the Hall of Fame, but see him get in the Hall of Fame as soon as possible so he can be there to enjoy it. I think he's earned that. I'm getting a little teary-eyed here because we've seen a lot of times players get in posthumously, and you just think, you know what, it's great for us as fans, but, I'd really love more than anything to see Dave Parker be able to get in the Hall of Fame and be there to celebrate it. So, Dave, if you're listening, I hope you are listening, keep fighting the good fight. My heart goes out to you. And as I said, my grandfather had Parkinson's. I know it's not easy. Stay strong. I want you to know you have many fans out there pulling for you, praying for you. I'm praying for you, Dave, and you're in my thoughts, and I wanted to spend a lot of time here on this episode dedicating it to your Hall of Fame case, because I think you got a great one. Also, too, on a lighter note, Dave, if you're listening, I'll say it one more time. We'd love to get another book out there about your experiences in the Oakland A's. Love to hear it. I'm currently reading Howard Bryant's biography of Ricky Henderson. It's fantastic, and I have to hear Dave Parker's version of events when it comes to stories about Ricky and Jose Canseco, McGuire, Dave Stewart, Tony La Russa, and the rest of those Oakland A's. So if you're out there, Dave, listening, love to hear that book about the Oakland A's. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please check out my other episodes and stay tuned for my next episode where we discuss Felix Hernandez, who will be appearing on the ballot for the first time in this upcoming 2025 ballot. Until then, remember, when life gets you down, stop what you're doing and watch a baseball game.